Welcome back, everyone, for our panel on North Korea. I'm Owen Alterman. First of all, I want to say thank you to Emily and congratulations to Emily on the conference. For those of you who don't know, I worked here at the INSS as a research fellow, including in the Arms Control Program, before I moved on to my current job. It's great to be back. Emily, it was amazing working with you. Thank you for everything and congratulations. Moving on to the topic at hand, North Korea. The title of the panel is U.S. and North Korea, Can a Deal Be Reached? A little bit of a spoiler alert. We have three panelists, and if you look at what they've said and what they've written over the last few weeks, you can tell that none of them really truly believes that denuclearization is something that's in the cards. But, at least with two of them, and I think with the third too, they won't tell you, and won't tell us, I don't want to put words in their mouths, that the idea of diplomacy is a bad path. And that the answer to the question, can a deal be reached, is no. And I think one thing I'm interested in hearing from all of you is exactly what kind of a deal can be reached and how to reach it. So now for the introductions. Emily needs no introduction to this crowd, the head of the Arms Control and Regional Security Program here at INSS, and a senior research fellow here. We also have Alon Levkowitz, Dr. Alon Levkowitz, who is chair of social science and civic studies at Beit Berl College and also a fellow at the Begin Sadat Center. Alon is the go-to person in Israel for all things Korea. I was 2 days away from flying to Singapore for the summit, and before I flew out, of course, I gave Alon a call to pick his brain, and that's how I found out about every other Israeli journalist who was going to Singapore, because everybody was calling Alon.
At 2 o'clock in the morning, yeah.
Well, there's a time difference, I guess. So, Alon, we're thrilled to have you too. And third, coming in from Skype, from California, I believe, is Joshua Pollack, Senior Research Associate at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, and really an expert on North Korea specifically. And the other thing I'll say about all three of you, Emily and Alon, regular guests in I-24 News, most important thing, and Joshua Pollack, we had you on our air last night, so thank you to you too.
So it's an I-24 panel.
No, it's not. Mr. Pollack, I actually want to start with you because your institute made a lot of news this week, publishing satellite imagery of a facility in North Korea that you have concluded, that you have reported, has been refurbished, I guess. Work has continued to be conducted out there for production of missiles. Tell us a little bit about what you found, what it means, and what you think it should mean for the U.S. government specifically as Mike Pompeo is heading to Pyongyang to get there on Thursday.
Hi. Well, thanks for the invitation and the introduction. I'm actually sitting in Washington, D.C., where my office is, and I have to credit the recent discovery to my colleagues in Monterey, who are very attentive to developments in commercial satellite imagery, tracking it every day. We live in a new world now where every part of the Earth's surface, at least the land, is photographed from space every day at least once. So it's become a lot easier for research institutes or others with subscriptions to the right imagery providers to develop open source intelligence on their own. And this is a prime example of that. The facility that my colleagues Dave Schmerler and Jeffrey Lewis have been watching, among others, is called the Chemical Materiel Institute. It is a missile-related facility in the city of Hamhung, which is an industrial hub in North Korea. Kim Jong Un visited there back in August, and he got a tour of the facility. It was the first time they had revealed its existence to the world, and they showed that they are producing more advanced missile components there than they have in the past. He gave orders for the expansion of the facility to add production scale buildings to the place. So it is not just an experimental facility, but is actually a factory producing carbon-carbon tips for nose cones for reentry vehicles, producing new types of solid rocket motor casings that are more advanced and more lightweight, and other components that will contribute to their missile program, particularly their newer solid propellant medium-range missiles. So he gave orders to shift from experimental development from research and development, let's say, to full-scale production. And what Dave and Jeff found in the imagery is that his orders have been carried out, at least at the level of constructing the new facilities. Kim Jong Un was photographed viewing a painting of what the complete facility would look like. Well, that's now what the complete facility looks like. So at least externally, they have carried out his instructions pretty quickly. A lot of this construction took place during the negotiations this spring. What I think that tells us is that there's a wide gap in understanding, in vision between what the United States thinks it can achieve and what North Korea is willing to provide when it comes to their nuclear and missile programs. The North Koreans unilaterally in April announced that they would be ceasing nuclear testing and ceasing flight testing of ICBMs, and depending on how you read the statement, perhaps also intermediate range missiles, the sort that could reach Guam. They didn't say anything about not flight testing medium range or short range missiles. And they said nothing at all about production of missiles or warheads of any type. In fact, in his New Year address back in January, Kim Jong Un said it was time to engage in mass production of missiles and warheads. So I'd say what we see in the North Korean decision to engage in a test moratorium is they are willing to lower the profile of their program and not poke a stick in the eyes of the outside world, because they believe that they have achieved certain developmental milestones. Instead, they're transitioning to modernizing and expanding their arsenal and not making a big fuss about it anymore. They won't publicize the details, but we can still see what they're doing in broad strokes simply by watching them expand their facilities.
So thanks so much. Now, Emily, taking together both what the Middlebury Institute found, also the reports from NBC News and the Washington Post over the last few days, that the U.S. intelligence services don't seem to be big believers that Kim Jong Un is truly rolling back his program to the degree Donald Trump wants. But you've written in the past, including after the summit, that you think, and I talked about this a few minutes ago, that the talks could still be important and useful. And if so, why? And if so, what is the point of this process?
Okay, so I'll start by saying that the process vis-a-vis North Korea is actually very different from the process vis-a-vis Iran, for the simple reason that North Korea is a nuclear state. This is the result of decades of failed diplomacy, of relying on bad deals that North Korea reneged on. And most importantly, there were 8 years under the Obama administration of strategic patience, which was the president saying after the failure of the six-party talks, which finally collapsed in December 2008, President Obama came into office in January 2009, and I think in the beginning it was the correct approach. He said to the North Koreans, you know, until you're serious about denuclearization, I'm not going to be looking for you. You know, when you're serious, you come and we'll talk. But for 8 years, North Korea didn't come. Instead, North Korea did 4 more nuclear tests and any number of ballistic missile tests. And by the time the Trump administration came into office, North Korea was a full-fledged nuclear weapons state. So dealing with North Korea, thinking that you're going to be able to roll back North Korea's nuclear capabilities, I think is somewhat of an illusion. The dynamic that we've seen over the past year is quite easy to understand. If we, you know, cut away all the hyperbole what we saw is the following. Last July, North Korea demonstrated through missile tests that they have the ability to strike the U.S. mainland with a long-range ballistic missile. This was an important milestone in North Korea's nuclear program. The United States, as you know, treats the ability to threaten U.S. mainland differently than the ability to threaten allies or even territories like Guam. This elicited an immediate response from the Trump administration in an attempt to deter Kim Jong Un from even thinking about firing an actual ballistic missile, certainly not one married to a nuclear warhead that would hit the mainland United States. I would say that it would be surprising if the U.S. president had not issued a deterrent statement following that significant development last July. So indeed, we had a deterrent statement from President Trump, this famous fire and fury. I'll direct your attention to the fact that Mattis issued his own deterrent statement within a day or two, which was harsher even than fire and fury. But of course, Trump is the one that draws all attention. No one really noticed Mattis's deterrent statement, but both statements were definitely to be expected. This, however, elicited a response from the North Koreans, from Kim Jong Un, which elicited a response from the Trump administration, which elicited talk among the administration about possible preemptive action in North Korea, coming not from Trump necessarily, but from McMaster. You remember the grown-up in the room? And this continued over the autumn of last year, and it culminated with the messages that we heard in the new year. The next stage was Kim Jong-un signaling that he wants to change course. I think the talk about possible preemptive action worried Kim Jong-un, especially coming from this new administration, where there were no clear rules of the game yet for engagement, and certainly in the wake of the escalation of the deterrent statements, this seemed perhaps something that might actually become a reality. Trump might wake up one morning and order a preemptive attack on North Korea. That, in addition to the harsh sanctions that were placed on North Korea following their sixth nuclear test, which was conducted last September. I think the combined impact of those two events in particular brought him to look for a way to sort of climb down from the ladder. And he found a willing partner in this, the new leader of South Korea, who was also interested in improving inter-Korean relations between South Korea and North Korea, and thus the tension reduction process began with a North Korea-South Korea process, and that ultimately led to the idea of the summit. I think what we saw at the summit was an exercise in tension reduction. So the parties, the American side is talking about denuclearization because that is U.S. policy. They can't talk to North Korea about nuclear issues and not insist on denuclearization. But in fact, when facing a nuclear state, I have a feeling that the Trump administration understands that that goal is probably not going to be realized. Kim Jong-un offers denuclearization because he has nothing else to offer Trump in order to get him to engage. He knows that's what the U.S. president needs to hear. Therefore, he says he will denuclearize. But anyone well-versed in the years of negotiations with North Korea knows very well that the North Koreans have time and again promised denuclearization, to dismantle They even blew up a cooling tower at Yongbyon at one point. But everything they do, they then reverse and they backtrack. So North Korea's record is not of a state that is moving towards denuclearization. North Korea's record is of a state that is in dire economic, in a dire economic situation. Every advancement in the nuclear realm, they would get slapped with sanctions. Then they would look to engage with the international community. They always wanted to engage one-on-one with the U.S. Bush wouldn't allow that. So there were six-party talks. They would promise things. They would get economic assistance. And then they would go back to advancing their program. So I think what we're seeing is an exercise, as I said, in tension reduction. This is not surprising, but I don't think that this is going to lead to denuclearization. But in a situation where states are escalating their rhetoric, I think this is something to be welcomed, even if it doesn't lead to denuclearization.
We're going to pick up on that point of tension reduction and what the goals of the talks would be. First, Owen, I want to come to you on North Korea itself. Sketch out for us, as you would say in Hebrew, the mi neged mi in North Korea. Who are the different constituencies, at least the constituencies Kim Jong Un cares about? He is the supreme leader, but he needs to cater to constituencies within the country. Who are they? What do they care about? What do they disagree about? And when Donald Trump stands in front of us at that press conference and gives the performance he did in Singapore and talks about Kim Jong Un the way he did and talks about him wanting to transform the country, movie trailer in 2 languages and all, what are those constituencies in North Korea thinking? Are there any who are excited by that? Are there any who are scared by that? And how do they feel about the tension reduction goal that Emily talked about? And what do they want out of these talks? And maybe more importantly, what are they willing to concede?
Wow.
Sorry.
I need at least 20 seconds. First, I agree with whatever Emily says. I want to thank Emily for inviting me. I want to thank Donald Trump and Kim Jong Un for establishing this. And I want to say, before answering your questions, this is interesting. What you talked about, the new satellite photos. If you follow the social media, they use the terms that the social media, I would say the critical social media, they say it's fake news. And this is interesting. You would expect liberals to support Trump's policy towards North Korea. And they're saying all these news about North Korea trying to breach the negotiation, it's fake news by...
And this is in South Korea, South Korean social media.
No, this is in South Korea and in the U.S. People are saying this is fake news, that someone is trying to sabotage the negotiation because North Korea really wants to give up its nuclear weapon. That's what they think, but we call it democracy. Everyone can think whatever they want. Now, I would say, you mentioned the Singapore summit. This is interesting because the big question was about the summit between Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un at Panmunjom at the DMZ and the summit in Singapore. The biggest question is, will Kim Jong-un allow it to be seen in North Korea? Because think about it, you have a wonderful education system in North Korea. For them, you're educated that the big devil, the biggest enemy is the United States. And for the first time, they see their leader meeting with Donald Trump, the biggest enemy, the one who used sorry, the North Koreans are listening. Anyway. Okay. I'll talk. Oh, can I use your mic?
Yes.
Not just kidding. So it took them a few hours, and then they showed that Kim Jong Un met with Donald Trump, and this was an important move. And some of the North Koreans were saying, "What the fuck is going on?" But what happened? Now you talked about people. If you follow up the news, Kim Jong Un just told some of the guys in the military, some of the guys in politics, it's time to go home, because he's concerned that they would not accept the change. The party and the army and the industry are the important players, but Kim Jong-un controls these institutions. So for him, and this is the big question, we don't have any indication that they're saying this new policy is a threat on the establishment, on the party, on the army. And the big question, and I have to agree with Emily, and that's a problem for me to agree with her, that for the time being, what we have seen in North Korea is just the tactical maneuvers. They gave the Americans things that didn't influence the ability to continue to develop their nuclear and missile capabilities. We have to see what Pompeo will ask the North Koreans. And I'm sure, and this is in a way what Emily said, this is the modus operandi of the North Korean. Every time that they're giving up something or they're offering something, it will take them time to reverse it and to continue to develop. So the big question for the American administration is, how can you assure that the North Korean wouldn't do it again? Now, it becomes more complicated because Kim Jong-un knows how to play the game. And he has visited China, Xi Jinping, a few times because he needs a friend. He needs someone that will support him if the United States might decide to increase the sanctions. The important thing is that Donald Trump and Moon Jae-in agreed that the sanctions will continue despite what Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un agreed in that summit. So I agree with Emily. It's important that we're having a process, but I would say, optimist that it will succeed in leading North Korea to give up its nuclear weapon in the short run. Trump said 1 year, 2, 4, and Kim Jong-un knows that there's an election in the next few years in the United States, and he will use it as part of his tactics.
Now, I'm going to come back to the main topic of the negotiations and their purpose. But, Alon, I want to ask you a follow-up question on something you touched on, just South Korea and South Korean public opinion. I think to an Israeli watching South Korean public opinion, it's absolutely baffling to an Israeli. You have a country whose capital city of 10 million people is an artillery range of another country that is threatening it. And off and on, hot and cold, but threatening it over the course of decades, that's developing all the nuclear weapons that we know about. And yet you have a president who couldn't be more dovish, who's going to the border and walking across it with Kim Jong-un, who's encouraging Donald Trump to have a summit. Imagine Saudi Arabia taking that position on Iran, or Israel taking that position on Iran. Obviously, many differences in the cases, and there are explanations for what South Korean public opinion is at. I guess my question is, how do you explain South Korean public opinion? And to what extent are the government's policies contested in the media and in social media and among the public? Okay,
it's an interesting question for an Israeli that visits South Korea. Every time that I travel to South Korea, my Israeli friend has said to me, "Are you sure you want to go there? Because it's dangerous." And when I wanted to come back, my Korean friend told me, "Are you sure you want to go back to Israel? Because it's not safe." And the radio would call me at 3 o'clock in the morning. Is it safe in South Korea? But it's very complicated. Like in Israel, the media, you can divide the media between I would say leftist and rightist, or conservative or liberal. The liberal supports Moon Jae-in's policy. It sees this as an important opportunity, and part of it because they're afraid of Donald Trump. If you look at the polls, the biggest concern in South Korea, when the polls, is not the enemy, Kim Jong-un. Well, you can't call him the enemy. But the biggest concern is Donald Trump attacking North Korea and then dragging South Korea to war that no one intends to. So the liberal, pro-government news media will support it, will support this policy. The conservative are very skeptical. Some of the conservative social media and some of the conservative journals blame the president, Moon Jae-in, saying that he forgot that he's the president of South Korea and he's not the president of North Korea. They're saying he's giving North Korea too much without demanding anything. Some of them, when I saw the summit between North and South Korea, it was amazing. It was very emotional. But some of my colleagues in South Korea say, this is just politics. It doesn't worth a nickel. He just did it to gain the support of the public. So it depends on if you support the government or you oppose the government. The conservatives are having problems because for the time being, Moon Jae-in says, I'm trying to improve the relation with South Korea, but at the same time, I'm supporting Donald Trump's policy towards North Korea. So in a way, he is trying to balance, although Moon Jae-in expects Donald Trump to say, move on with all your policies, economic policies towards North Korea. Once he has the green light, they will try to develop projects in North Korea, but that's a different issue.
So we're going to go back to Joshua Pollack, and after that, you guys jump in as you see fit. Emily, you talked about tension reduction. Alon, if I understood you correctly, you talked about Kim Jong Un essentially dragging out the talks as long as he can and not really conceding much of anything. Mr. Pollack, you said on our air last night, responding to John Bolton's interview on one of the Sunday shows, that an all-or-nothing approach from the United States would be liable to get nothing, meaning that the United States should try to get something. How exactly does the United States try to get something, and what should that something or those some things be?
That's a good question. I would say, first of all, that in response to some of Emily's comments, that I think diplomacy is a good idea. And I agree with her that the Obama years were largely fruitless because of a lack of diplomacy with the North Koreans. You can look at it very simply. At the time of the collapse of the Leap Day deal, which was a very tentative effort by the Obama administration to see if there was any basis for negotiations with the North Koreans. This took place in talks through the second half of 2011, and finally the so-called deal was announced in February of 2012. But lasted just a few weeks before it fell apart. Since that time, the North Koreans have conducted 3/4 of their missile tests in their history, and 4 out of their 6 nuclear tests. They went from having, I think, maybe a 4, 5, 6 kiloton device to maybe a 300 kiloton hydrogen bomb. They went from having a medium-range missile, the NODOM, being their most advanced, successfully flight-tested missile, to having the Hwasong-15 ICBM, their most advanced flight-tested missile, capable of reaching all of the United States. I think it was a mistake, certainly with the benefit of hindsight, for the United States to sit back on its haunches and refuse to talk to the North Koreans except under the most stringent circumstances, which I think we all knew they would not satisfy. Having said that, what do we get now out of any effort to negotiate with them? Well, I think, first of all, the pledge they made unilaterally in April not to conduct nuclear testing could be strengthened. We could try to get them into a legally binding arrangement to commit not to do additional nuclear testing through the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Get them to join that. I think the debate on the CTBT in the United States has circled around the issues of what does this require the United States to give up? It would be more constructive now to look at it in terms of what does it require North Korea to give up, or Iran to give up. Because the fact is, the United States, having conducted over 1,000 nuclear tests, has very little use for additional testing compared to these newcomer states, which have a lot of use for it. It still means a lot to them, especially the Iranians who haven't done any. And it would be good to lock in, to the extent possible, restraint on their side. Similarly, the North Koreans, as far as we are aware, are still producing fissile material for additional nuclear weapons. It would be useful to try to get them to shut down facilities and cap the size of their arsenal. Now, the reports we've seen in the media claim that they have hidden facilities for enrichment. And one possibility is that they might expose one of these facilities, give it up, and continue to produce at another. That is clearly less than desirable. However, the more facilities they give up, the better. It's just from a very simple perspective, the less they can make, the less they'll have. So I think that if we were willing to take that more is more, less is less perspective a long time ago, we would have kept the North Korean nuclear arsenal at a much smaller size than it probably is today. We don't know how big it is for sure. Every bit helps is what I'm saying. And while I would like them to freeze production completely, I think even just getting them to freeze the facilities at Yongbyon would be a win for the United States and its allies. So these are the sorts of things that I think are within reach. Also, commitments on not exporting nuclear technology. Mm-hmm. While that's hard to verify, getting the commitment in the first place is of value because the North Koreans know by now that we do have the ability to catch them cheating, not just the United States, but its allies like Israel, as in the case of the reactor being built in Syria. So getting them to commit not to export nuclear technology, knowing that they could be caught, would give them something to lose. Because whatever benefits they would get from a new understanding with the United States would be at risk if they were caught cheating. So that's another area that we should explore in talks. I think that when National Security Advisor Bolton demands a plan for dismantling North Korea's entire nuclear, chemical, biological, and missile programs in the space of a year, he is at best taking a maximalist position for bargaining purposes, and at worst being purposefully counterproductive, because the North Koreans will never agree to that. And anything they do agree to, you would have to treat with suspicion if it's that far-reaching. They want to hedge their bets. They don't trust us. We, the United States, the United States-South Korean alliance, have massive advantages over North Korea in conventional military power, and they clearly feel the need to offset that. So they are not going to give up their nuclear weapons anytime soon. I think they are willing to avoid using them in a coercive setting and sort of withdraw them from the top of the agenda. But they're going to keep them within easy reach for purposes of deterrence.
Can I have
Yeah, reactions, go for it.
Okay.
You're the boss.
Well, I agree with the points that Joshua raised with regard to the something that can be asked, and obviously the less fissile material that North Korea has, the better. But I think the most important something that can be asked is really with regard to North Korea's role as a proliferator to other countries and possibly other entities. In other words, if we look at North Korea's motivation in the nuclear realm, we find that nuclear weapons for North Korea are a moneymaker. And some people over the years have said cynically that their nuclear tests are basically to show prospective buyers our stuff works. And this is something that needs to be curbed, okay? The North Koreans were building, obviously, as Joshua said, the nuclear reactor in Syria. There's been vast and varied cooperation in the non-conventional realm between North Korea and Iran, and it has touched upon the nuclear realm as well, not least the fact that there were Iranian scientists who were present at least at the nuclear test from 2013. And this kind of cooperation needs to stop. So that's definitely something that can be on the table. And it's not denuclearization, and it's certainly something that I think North Korea can respond to, especially when we understand the motivation for it. I want to say something else about North Korea's motivation in the nuclear realm. It's a moneymaker, and it's also mainly a prestige factor. If we look at North Korean behavior over the years, it's always, there's this sense of almost like a 2-year-old saying, me, look at me, I'm doing all this stuff, look at me, pay attention to me, talk to me. The North Koreans have been trying for years to get a bilateral audience with the United States. This, for North Korea, is a big win. They wanted to meet the Americans, and this goes back to the Bush administration and well, the Clinton administration. They did meet bilaterally, not Clinton, but the administration did. But the idea was, and Kim Jong-il would reiterate this point, you know, we will meet with you, we will talk about nuclear issues, but it's not going to be that you dictate to us that we need to dismantle. We will talk to you about nuclear issues, nuclear state to nuclear state. And we can talk about denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which would include us, but it will also include you, including your nuclear umbrella that you have put over Japan and South Korea. So it's a prestige factor for North Korea. In their eyes, they see this as something that brings them sort of to equal standing with the United States. And I think it's important to understand that as well, because even though they are presenting a real threat to the United States, the ability to hit the mainland is obviously a very severe message for the United States. But if we look at this realistically, obviously there's no symmetry here, right? If North Korea were actually to do something, I believe that North Korea would be obliterated. And I think that Kim Jong Un understands this. So I don't think there's really much risk that Kim Jong Un is going to lob a nuclear missile at the United States. The more dangerous activities that North Korea is engaged in are really these activities as a proliferator of technologies and know-how and components to anyone that will pay hard cash. This is a really dangerous aspect of North Korea with regard to its nuclear program.
Alon.
A comment about what Joshua and Emily said. No one agree. The intelligence community in the United States don't agree on how many nuclear bombs does North Korea has. It can be between 20 to 60. 61.
Latest number reported the Washington Post was 65.
65? 68? Anyone else? So let's make it 70. Okay, you got it. You won. You're the winner. It gives an advantage to North Korea by offering. You say we have 70 nuclear bombs. We're going to give up just 20. And what can you offer for us? This is the best bargaining wizard in the market. In North Korea are the experts. The biggest problem is verification. How can we verify that North Korea would abide with what they're promising? Can we verify that North Korea would not export nuclear capabilities to Syria, Iran, etc.? There's another issue that we didn't mention. You've been to South Korea, so you know the issue. The U.S. forces in South Korea, the U.S. forces in Japan. Trump talks about what do we need them. Some would say it's part of the negotiation. Pay more, they will stay there. Although, if you wouldn't have any U.S. forces in Japan and in South Korea, that means that they don't need to buy U.S. weapons. They can buy Israeli weapons, and this is a
right. The important point you made to me before Singapore, that it's not about those 30,000 or 28,000 or I think it's 38,000 U.S. troops are sitting in Syria. That is a way to have leverage on the South Koreans to buy American arms.
Yeah, well, when he came back from Asia, he said, "Thank you for buying U.S. arms." So this is an economic issue. But the South Koreans are concerned, especially the military institute in Japan as well. It might force Japan to change its defense policy. Plus, Japan is concerned that the United States focus on the ICBM only, and they're not focusing on the short-range missiles that threaten Japan. Thank you.
With the time that's left, I want to actually bring it back to that subject near and dear to our hearts in Israel. What does it mean about us? What does it mean about the Middle East? And the obvious comparisons and contrasts with Iran. I don't want to start a bar fight here, but Joshua Pollack, you're a supporter of the Iran deal. What are the lessons to you from the Iran experience to what's going on in North Korea? And Emily, not exactly a big supporter of the Iran deal. You talked about it before, but maybe flesh that a little bit more. What's your the big lessons from the Iran experience to what we're seeing in North Korea?
Well, if I can start, I think that like Emily said earlier, the biggest difference between the two countries is that North Korea has the bomb. That, in the Obama administration, I think, meant that more could be achieved with Iran because they could be stopped short of getting the bomb. It's much harder to roll back and much easier to stop short. So they made a conscious choice to work harder on the Iranians and keep the North Koreans at arm's length. There was, after all, a big domestic political price to pay for negotiating with enemies. And if they were going to do it, they were going to do something where they felt that there was a chance of success and a chance of a more meaningful result. Whereas we all know the North Koreans are extremely difficult to deal with, and they had already passed certain thresholds. So one simple lesson is move earlier and be willing to apply sanctions pressure and be willing to negotiate with adversaries before they cross these key thresholds. Don't make them prove to you that they have certain, the will to go beyond a certain point and the technical capabilities, because you might be surprised. So don't make them prove it, because once they've proved it, it's going to be very hard to get them to go back, probably impossible. That I think is the fundamental lesson, and one of the reasons why I think that the Iran deal, which precisely because it is a deal, is less than what one might want. That is still much preferable to sitting and waiting and seeing what happens. The other lesson from the Iran deal is you cannot simply dictate to other countries, even if they are smaller. This is a lesson I think that Israelis can understand from the alliance relationship with the United States. The United States is often displeased with what Israel does, whether it involves the settlements, or it involves nuclear capabilities, or military actions. Say the raid in Iraq in 1981, or in Tunis in 1985. But that doesn't mean that the United States can simply dictate to the other party, even if the other party is smaller and less powerful. There are asymmetries of interest that make it very difficult, even for an extremely powerful country like the United States, to have its way in all circumstances. And this is certainly true with enemies and as well as allies. So I think our ability to reach a compromise with Iran, even though it was a compromise that heavily favored our interests, it didn't bring us everything we wanted. That's a lesson for dealing with the North Koreans. You can't always get every last thing you want, and you cannot simply have your way. One mistake I think that President Trump has made is perceiving the willingness of the North Koreans to negotiate as a function of the maximum pressure campaign, as we call it in the United States. The North Koreans certainly don't see it that way, and for all of the perceptions that Kim Jong Un was worried about what Donald Trump might do, I suspect that he believes what he says when he says that essentially it was North Korea's technological achievements with hydrogen bombs and ICBMs that brought the United States to the table. Why wouldn't he believe that? He tested his first successful hydrogen bomb to all appearances last September. The first ICBM that could reach all of the United States last November. And in March, Donald Trump agrees to sit down with it, something that no previous American leader had agreed to do. And that's a turnaround from Trump threatening him at the United Nations last September. So from Kim's perspective, it certainly looks like he can't be pushed around. Now maybe he's making the same mistake and thinking he can dictate the outcome because he has ICBMs and he has hydrogen bombs. That too would be a mistake. But I think we would be well advised to heed the lesson of the Iran deal, which is you cannot simply dictate the outcomes. You have to accept imperfect outcomes that still advance your interests.
So Emily, from a deal opponent, what are the lessons from Iran on North Korea?
So I agree basically with what Josh said about the Obama administration. I mean, I think the 8 years of strategic patience basically reflect the assessment of the Obama administration that they were not going to be able to turn this around. And the truth is that even if there had been rounds of negotiations, I'm pretty sure we would have seen maybe 2 more nuclear tests, maybe 3, and maybe even 4. So if we're realistic, whether it was strategic patience and sitting on his haunches or trying to negotiate, probably would have been the same result because North Korea was already then a nuclear state. And Obama chose to put all his energy into Iran. That's true. I think the Iran deal is seriously flawed. This is no secret. But I give the Obama administration a lot of credit for putting a lot of energy into trying to stop Iran before it crosses the threshold. The tragedy is that the negotiation went badly, and we're not going to go into that. And I think Trump is basically reflecting the same kind of a differentiation between how he is relating to North Korea and how he's relating to Iran. Trump understands actually, or the administration, I believe, understands that North Korea is lost. As I said, they talk about denuclearization, but it's hard to believe that they really believe that's a realistic goal. And therefore, he needs to engage in order. I mean, Trump's options are very limited vis-a-vis North Korea, and he wants to reduce tensions as well. He doesn't want this to be such a strong problem. But we see a very different approach towards Iran, because Iran hasn't crossed the threshold yet, and there's still a chance that Iran can be stopped. I think what Josh said about moving earlier, this is the real conclusion for arms control if we look at these 2 proliferators, Iran and North Korea. If you want to stop a determined proliferator, you have to do it very early. When Israel bombed in Syria, there were those that came to Israel and said, why did you do it at such an early stage? It was still being constructed. Why didn't you bring your intelligence to the IAEA and let them investigate and maybe spend 10 years investigating and trying to negotiate and seeing what they can do? No, if you really want to stop a determined proliferator, you're going to have to do it early. I'm not advocating necessarily military force. In this case, it was military force. But if we look back at the past 15 years, the only success story that we have in stopping determined proliferators is Syria, because it was early and it was decisive. I think the lesson of North Korea for Iran is don't rely on bad nuclear deals. And don't allow the proliferator to cross the threshold of nuclear weapons, because once they cross the threshold, it's game over.
Now, short on time, so a lightning round to each of you. We'll start with Alon, and then Emily, and then Joshua Pollack. Looking ahead, what's the best case, realistic scenario, the realistic best case scenario for North Korea? What's the realistic worst case scenario? And what do you think is going to happen when we're sitting here on July 3rd, 2019, talking about North Korea? What are we going to be talking about?
2020 is better a date because it's going to be the football, the Olympics, Tokyo Olympics. It's more interesting. The good deal is that Kim Jong Un really means to give up his nuclear weapon, and is open to the discussion, and they agree on a process, not in 1 year. It might take about 2 years to denuclearize, stop nuclear tests, missiles, etc. This is the optimistic, and we live in the Middle East, so optimistic doesn't work. The pessimistic scenario is that it fails. Trump understands that Kim Jong Un is a nice guy. I trust him, but he cheats, and that's why Trump would react in a very emotional way by considering tactical attack or increasing the sanctions. This is why Kim Jong Un visited Xi Jinping a few times to have a guarantee that Donald Trump wouldn't do these things. So these are in a way the optimistic and pessimistic. That's why I'm optimistic that we're in the middle.
I'll be very brief. The best case scenario is that rules of the game for living with a nuclear North Korea will be carved out, and North Korea will not arouse as such tension and fear. The worst is that this doesn't happen and Kim continues on an aggressive path in the nuclear realm, and certainly if it continues to proliferate its components, technologies, etc., to others.
And Joshua Pollack.
I think the realistic best case, and this is optimistic but not wildly, is that North Korea will suspend most or all of its fissile material production and agree not to sell nuclear technology abroad. I think the realistic worst case is that Donald Trump will feel betrayed and will lash back at the North Koreans, perhaps if they do a space launch, which is something they haven't promised to refrain from, but it tends to be interpreted as an ICBM test here. And that would return us to the crisis atmosphere of 2017 or worse, get us into a war. What's most likely? I'm not sure, but I think it's probably a case of we muddle along and don't really achieve any agreement, but this process just continues to unspool in negotiations and drag on, and there's neither a blow-up nor a great achievement.
Thank you to our panel. Just one quick point that I was thinking as I listened to all of you, and it's potentially, I think, a policy point for the Israeli government. All of you talked about the issue of proliferation being something that's achievable in the talks with North Korea. If that's the case, that's something that affects Israel, potentially. And the question is Israel making this an issue in its relationship with the United States? Is this something that Israel's lobbying for? Should it be something Israel's lobbying for? And how high of a priority should it be for Israel in its relations with the U.S.? I'm not asking those rhetorically. I actually don't know the answer to those questions. And it's obviously another panel entirely, but one thought that I'm left with. I want to thank all of you. I want to thank our panelists, and thank you very much.